Hey folks, here I am from my classroom recording a review of literary terminology for the Renaissance Poetry assessment that you'll be taking next class. So I'm going to go through here and try and record everything for you so that you can have this to use, but I'm also going to attach the terms list itself so that you've got that in your file and you can open it. Remember, the assessment is going to be open note, so you're welcome to use these notes or any notes you take while doing this as you take the assessment. I'm not so much interested in you memorizing the definitions of literary terms as I am in you being able to spot these things in material that you're actually reading. And so that's always what I test for, that you've developed the skill to be able to see it. Memorizing the definition of a elegy is less important because you always have your phone. You can always look up what an elegy is, but if you don't know that it's an elegy when you're reading it, it doesn't help you out. So let's look at the types of poems that we ran into in the Renaissance unit. First off, we ran into a lot of sonnets. You should be able to identify a sonnet at this point. A sonnet's a 14-line poem written in iambic pentameter with an intricate rhyme scheme, and it's usually about love, particularly about unrequited love. A lot of the terms that follow deal with those elements of sonnets, but you should know that. An elegy is a formal death poem or a poem more generally about mortality. In other words, it reminds you as a reader that you're going to die and that life is short and that we need to use it to its fullest. Two poems, well, I guess three poems that we read really dealt with the idea of mortality. One of them was Ben Jonson's On My First Son, which was pretty intensely sad about his son who died on his 7th birthday. And then two of them were also metaphysical poems by John Donne, A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which he wrote the poem as if he were dead and he was trying to console his wife, and Death Be Not Proud, or Holy Sonnet 10, which was a sonnet addressed to death itself. All of those could be rightfully considered elegies. Now you'll note that sometimes poems fit into more than one category, like Holy Sonnet 10, also called Death Be Not Proud, was a sonnet, but it was addressed to death, and it was also about the concept of death as an idea, and so it really falls into three categories: sonnet, elegy, and metaphysical poem, and you just sort of need to figure out where they fit. Speaking of metaphysical poetry, a metaphysical poem is a poem that focuses on abstract concepts and ideas and relies heavily on figurative language, and this new term called conceit, which is a branch of figurative language, sort of one step up from metaphor. You got simile, then you got metaphor, then you got conceit, and we'll look at that when we get down to it as well. Metaphysical poems are always educationally elite. They're sort of elitist. They ask you to do a lot of mental gymnastics and have a lot of ability to think and interpret. A ballad is a story written in song in rhyming quatrains. The rhyme scheme for a ballad is ABAB or ABCB. There's lots of ballads out there. The easiest way is just to see if you can sing it to the tune of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary had a little lamb, she fed it very well. Her father fed it dynamite and blew it all to pieces. That's not how it goes, no. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. That will give you, your ballad stanza, so you can just check and see if you can sing it to that tune, if it's in quatrains, if there's sort of the first one has more syllables, first line has more syllables than the second line, and the third line has more than the fourth line, it's going to alternate sort of that way. Iambic pentameter, those are lines that are 10 syllables long. They're in a repeated pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. We learned this because sonnets are written in iambic pentameter. If you count the number of syllables in all of those lines, they're always going to be 10. Shakespeare writes a lot of his verse moments in his plays in iambic pentameter, so you need to be aware of that as well. In fact, iambic pentameter is the most commonly used, meter in English because it most closely mirrors English speech. All right. Rolling down a little bit. End rhyme. We looked at the rhyme schemes of a lot of poems. You need to do that. So end rhyme is we're looking at the last word in the line. So if you look at a line of poetry is not a sentence. A line of poetry is, just what it sounds like, one line that stops. The sentence is it's still going to be grammatically correct, but a sentence is going to take multiple lines, sometimes 4 or more lines before it gets completed. But the line itself, look at the last word on the line, and then look at other words in the poem. Anything that rhymes with it is going to have the same letter. So remember, you start with A. Anything that rhymes with that first line is going to be an A. If the next line doesn't rhyme with the first line, it's a B. Anything else in the poem that rhymes with that second line is a B, and so on and so forth until you've done the rhyme scheme for the poem. The rhyme schemes for sonnets in particular, but all poems, are composed of poetic units. You know, a lot of times they're put in stanzas, but they're not always. And a sonnet is all one stanza, so it doesn't have separation. So you have to be able to look at the rhyme scheme to find the separations in a sonnet. And generally a sonnet is broken into, it's 14 lines, so it's broken into groups, right? So a couplet is a pair of rhyming lines, A, B, B, C, C, etc. A quatrain is 4 lines that share a rhyme scheme, like A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, D. No, that's a lie. A, B, C, B, or A, B, B, A. Any of those is fine. Sestet is 6 lines that share a rhyme scheme, like A, B, A, B, A, B, or A, B, C, A, B, C. Those would be examples of sestets. Or an octave would be 8 lines that share a rhyme scheme, like ABBA, ABBA, or AB, 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 you know, all the way on until you get to 8 lines. There's lots of ways to do this. The bigger the poetic unit, the more various combinations there are in there. And so anyway, you need to be able to identify couplets, quatrains, sestets, and octaves. A sonnet being 14 lines is often an octave and a sestet. 8 and 6 is 14. Or it's 3 quatrains and a couplet. 12 and 2 is 14. Or it's an octave, a quatrain, and a couplet. 8 and 4 and 2 is 14. So just be able to identify those things on the assessment. You should be good to go. We also want to look at the famous rhyme schemes here. A Petrarchan sonnet is an octave and a sestet. ABBA, ABBA, that's the octave. It's always the same. The sestet is either going to be CDE, CDE, or CD, CD, CD. So that's there. A Shakespearean or English sonnet is ABAB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG. So it's 3 quatrains and a couplet. And a Spenserian sonnet is also 3 quatrains and a couplet. ABAB, BC, BC, CD, CD, EE. But we have an interlocking rhyme pattern where the second rhyme of the first quatrain is the first rhyme of the second quatrain, and the second rhyme of the second quatrain is the first rhyme of the third quatrain, and so on. And so there's like an interlock going on there. Sonnets originally were about unrequited love. Shakespeare changed that by writing about real love and real relationships that he was in, and then Donne took it a step farther and started writing about, you know, religious love, love for God and things like that. We also looked at sound devices. You need to be able to identify sound devices within a poem. These sound devices, rhyme is a sound device, by the way, so end rhyme sort of fits under here as well. But these sound devices fall into 3 categories that we looked at: alliteration, consonants, and assonance. I do want to be very clear about this. When I talk about alliteration, consonants, and assonance, we're talking about within a line of poetry. You can't look at a quatrain and say, hey, look, these 4 words have assonance together. It's because they rhyme, folks. Rhyme and sound devices are different. You're looking within one line of poetry to try and find those sound devices. Yes, sometimes they carry over into the next line, but I'm trying to draw a line of demarcation here so you're not looking at the rhyme and being like, hey, look, there's sound devices. Of course there are. In order for something to rhyme, it has to have both consonants and assonance. We're looking at the ending vowel and consonant sounds being the same. Otherwise, it wouldn't rhyme. In fact, in a lot of rhymes, the only thing that's different is the opening consonant sound. So don't fall into that trap and try and give me rhymes and tell me that they're consonants or whatever. So our 3 types of sound devices. We looked at alliteration all the way back in Anglo-Saxon poetry. Most of you guys are really clear and good on that. That's repetition of first consonant sounds, like Harris hates hamburgers. Look at that H sound at the beginning of each of them. It really doesn't matter what the beginning sound is as long as it's not a vowel. If it's a vowel, A, E, I, O, and U, sometimes Y, then it is assonance, not alliteration. So make sure when you try and identify alliteration for me, you're not getting vowel sounds in there. Consonants. is the same as alliteration, except that it's at the ends of words. That's the key. In poetry, we're looking at consonants. We're looking at the ends of words. Some people are still just looking at consonant sounds wherever they show up. That's more generally, I guess, a definition of consonants. But when you look at it in poetry, you're flipping it. Instead of looking at the beginning sounds of words, you're looking at the ending sounds of words. So a good example would be the same sentence. Harris hates hamburgers. Look at that. S, s, s. All of those are S's. But be aware, English is a difficult language and sounds are tricky. Those fierce darts is actually a line from Sir Philip Sidney's Sonnet 39 that has consonants and they're all spelled differently. Silent E makes no sound, so it's not going to affect the ending sound of a word. The ending sound of the word is the letter before it, in this case S, in this case C, and in this case S, but they all make an S sound. So those fierce darts all has that clear S sound at the end of it. Then we've got assonance, which is the trickiest of the three. Assonance is repetition of vowel sounds. Again, Harris hates hamburgers. Harris hates hamburgers, right? It's all the same vowel sound. The problem occurs because in English, vowel sounds change. Some vowels make multiple sounds. Some combinations of vowels make multiple sounds. So like B, that's a hard E sound, E-E. C, S-E-A, is a hard E sound. Happy is a hard E sound. Being is a hard E sound. Flee is a hard E sound. So is flee, F-L-E-A. So, you know, like it's tricky to identify vowel sounds, and you just need to sort of say them to yourself and listen with your ear. Poetry was not designed to be read with the eyes. It was originally lyric poetry. It was sort of song lyrics. It was meant to be heard. And these are all devices that the old poets used to make their poetry memorable, you know, to make it have an impact and last. And they did a good job with that. So those are your three sound devices. I'm definitely going to ask you to find some of those things in a poem, so you need to know those. Moving on. We also looked at figurative language. Remember, figurative language is anything that is not literally happening. So if it's not literally happening, if we're imagining that it's happening, if it's happening sort of in our heads, we call it figurative. So imagine this is a drop-down menu. You're going to click on figurative language and then boop, it's going to populate with all this stuff. The easiest figurative language is the simile. It's a comparison. It uses like or as. You know, my love is like fire. Okay, that's a simile. We're asking you to think about the ways that love is like fire. It's a burning passion. A metaphor would be a comparison not using like or as. My love is ice. Okay, that's asking you to do something a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complex, to actually assume that these two things are the same. But they're not. And so you have to think about the ways in which they're the same or the ways in which they're different. A conceit is something that shows up in metaphysical poetry. It's essentially an extended metaphor, usually between an idea or an emotion, say the idea of death or the emotion of love, and a physical object or an everyday experience. I gave you that one about love is like a stapler, right? It binds two things together. They can be pulled apart, but there's going to be a mark in those papers that is going to last forever. So the idea here is we're not only saying, hey, these two things are the same, but we're going through and we're showing you all the ways that they are the same. So in the poem A Valediction Forbidding Mourning by John Donne, he compared love to a math compass, right? You've got two souls, like the compass has two sides, but they're joined, they're linked. Everywhere they go, they're always together. He also had one where he compared death to sleep, something that we experience every day. At the end of a long day, you're like, I can't wait to go to sleep. He says, at the end of a long life, we should be looking forward to death in the same way. So he's trying to sort of change the terms on death. That's an example of a conceit. An oxymoron is two contradictory words placed together. For example, cold fire or bitter sweet. You run into those. Poor man's wealth, heavy grace. These are all sort of ones that we've run into during the unit. A paradox is a little more complex than an oxymoron. I like to think of oxymoron and paradox as being similar in the way that simile and metaphor are similar. Paradox asks you to do a little bit more. A paradox is an illogical or impossible statement that holds some figurative truth. So literally impossible, figuratively true. That's what you got to keep in your mind. So, yeah, I've got Oscar Wilde's here. There are only two tragedies in life. One is not getting what one wants, and the other is getting it. Okay, but the one that we ran into was in Spencer's sonnet about fire and ice. He said that his love was like fire and his love interest's love was like ice. So he felt burning passion for her and she felt cold to him. And the hotter he got for her, the colder she got to him. So his fire was making her ice colder and her ice was kindling his fire. Both of these things are impossible on a literal level, but on a figurative level, they make sense. And therefore we develop a paradox. There's another paradox, very famously shows up in Sidney's poem, Thou Blind Man's Mark. He ends with the idea that his only desire is to be rid of desire. Well, isn't the desire to get rid of desire a desire itself? And can you ever get rid of desire? So is he ever going to be successful? Like, these are some natural questions that come up, and it makes it paradoxical. Another example would be at the end of Holy Sonnet 10, John Donne says, "Death, you shall die." Well, death is an idea. It can't die. That's illogical or impossible. But if you consider from a Christian perspective that once you die, your physical body dies, but your soul becomes eternal, well, then your soul can never die again. And therefore, the only thing that dies when you die is death. It's a paradox because on a literal level, it makes no sense. But on a figurative level, you're like, and it makes sense. Hyperbole. That's a fancy word for exaggeration. We've seen a lot of this throughout sonnets especially. Sonnet writers love to exaggerate attributes and feelings. For example, in the Fire and Ice sonnet, Spencer said that he burns much more in boiling sweat when he's thinking of her. First off, sweat is liquid. It can't burn you. Nobody's blazing with sweat. And two, your sweat can't boil. If your sweat boiled, you die. Right, so that would be an example. Or, in Sonnet 39 about sleep, he said that sleep was a shield against the fierce darts despair throws. Okay, your sad thoughts could be sad, but they're not literally going to stab you like darts. So that's a metaphor. It's also a personification, giving human traits to inanimate objects, despair throwing darts. But this idea that your sad thoughts are physically wounding you is absolutely hyperbole. It's hyperbolic. So hyperbole is a fancy word for exaggeration. Giving human traits, actions or emotions to inanimate objects. You see that a lot, again, despair throwing darts, stuff like that. Then we had a lot of poems that had apostrophe in them. Apostrophe is talking to something that cannot respond. So we looked at Sidney. Sidney was big on this. Sidney's poem, Thou Blind Man's Mark, it was addressed to desire, as if desire could ever respond to you. He talked to desire, he called it names, he challenged it. All of that happened. We also had the same author, Sidney, do one where he talked to sleep. As if sleep could respond. Ben Jonson wrote that elegy on my first son in which he talked to his dead son who's not going to respond. We also saw, John Donne in Holy Sonnet 10 write his sonnet addressed to death as if death could respond. But more generically, we had a number of sonnets in which the authors wrote to a woman that wasn't present. It's like they were talking to them, but they weren't there. And that generically is an example of apostrophe as well, talking to anybody who's not physically there. All right, last one is symbols. When something represents something else, hopefully you've gotten better over the course of this unit at identifying symbols. There's been plenty of them. Love symbolized as fire, hate or apathy symbolized as ice. Sleep symbolized as a shield, love symbolized as the rising sun or as a rock that will hold strong through a storm, or as a star to a sailor at sea. I could go on, but anytime that you see something that's symbolic, where something is representing something else, you need to be able to identify it and say what represents what. I'm quite sure I'm going to ask you a question about that on the assessment. All right, we're at about 20 minutes. That's where I wanted this to be. If you have any questions, do not hesitate to ask. If you don't ask your questions, you live forever in ignorance, and that's a choice you make. So please ask, and I will try and answer. Thank you.